Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have people on the show for whom all of those are relevant today. This is Andy Revkin at the Earth Institute and Climate School at Columbia University, our thriving online session of the Sustain What broadcasts I've been doing through this past year, which are about how do we make progress on tough issues, and with a particular focus on communication. And as some who are watching are probably aware, this is Show Your Stripes Day today. And this concept of stripes representing the warming trend on the planet or at different scales in your community, as far as I could tell, started with Ed Hawkins, a climate scientist in the UK. You'll learn more about him in a second from him. And today also on the show, we got a really great array of people experimenting and trying to understand the impact of this kind of visual communication around an issue like climate change. I've been writing about climate change for more than 30 years, and there's always been a visual component. I'll just show you my 1988 cover story of Discover magazine was very visual. It's the familiar melting planet. Of course, it was complicated because back then, this is 1988, the back of the magazine, we were selling cigarettes. So that's as they were visually selling cigarettes while we're visually selling climate concern. This is a hard landscape. And I think that's where Ulrika's work comes in. Ulrika Hahn is studying the behavioral and psychological and sociological components of this. But you'll hear from her as well. And then we have knitters, the Tempest Tube Project. You'll meet the couple who started this and inspired by Ed Hawkins, and Alexander Radke, who's an engineer in Germany who has taken the stripes forward into the future, warning stripes, from warming stripes to warning stripes. And everyone here has a really cool part of this story to tell. I'd like to start with a little, let's see if I can get this to work. Hopefully the sound will be there. One of the ultimate expressions of warming stripes was 2019 in your hometown. Ed, maybe you could describe this and how the band came to be part of this in a second, but let me just play this clip for a second. Wow. So I understand you weren't there that day, but that must have been pretty inspiring to see. This has been on the cover of The Economist magazine. It's the backdrop at rock concerts. It's on ties of meteorologists all around the world today. My friend Jeff Berardelli, John Morales, many other meteorologists are latched on. So Ed, let's just get the origin story down here a little bit. How did this begin? What inspired a climate scientist at the University of Reading to become a communicator?
So I guess, I've always been interested in visualization throughout my career, and just trying to represent what we're doing in as simple a way as possible to try and spread the message and start conversations. And so the stripe started actually with an event at a famous literary festival, the Hay Literary Festival in England, which has been going for decades. And it's not normally the type of festival where climate scientists go and speak, but I was invited to do an event with an amazing poet called Nicola Davies. And I was just looking for a way of talking to an audience which wouldn't normally be used to seeing scientific graphics or graphs about the reality of our changing world. And so I came up with the idea of just using colours to represent the changes in temperature. And the version I showed at that event was for the town of Hay, where the event is held, where there's data going back to the 1870s. And just like in the global picture you can see behind me, and in that little clip, you see the blues change to reds, even for one little town in England. And it just struck home, and I could see people in the audience, their eyes open, the pennies dropped. To this audience who wouldn't normally be going to any kind of science event, could understand the reality of our warming world very, very clearly. So
particularly because it was their climate specifically, you think?
Exactly, and I think that's really important. That the global image is critical, because that is the key that we're looking at, the warming of our planet. But if we're going to talk about this on a local level and communicate to the fact that the climate change is affecting people locally and here and now, we have to talk about how things are changing where people live, and so therefore doing it at the small scales and demonstrating that even in a small village in the middle of Wales, that you can see the temperatures increasing. That starts the conversation about what it means locally.
And how did you develop that? The technology part, the backstory. I'll go to the Show Your Stripes page in a second, but it's one thing to do a one-off. Then how do you make a tool that makes this replicable?
So I had a conversation with Robert Roeder, who runs a group called the Berkeley Earth Project,
sure,
which is one of the big global temperature data sets. And they produce estimates for temperature change for every country around the world. And so I asked him, and he provided the data for each of the countries. And so I simply made the graphics for every country. And then some colleagues of mine at the University of Reading built quite a simple little website where you could just download the graphic for whichever country you're interested in. And people could show it wherever they wanted. They're all for free. You can use them however you want to have these conversations. I'm
showing it right now. You can go to Central America. Yeah. You can type in Guatemala, or there's Belize. We'll just do this really quickly. Yeah. And there's the warming stripes for Belize with the data that are available. Yeah. Right there. So it's pretty cool. And then you generate a graphic. You can download it. You can print it. You can do anything with it. Yeah. What's your sense of the response? When you think about how this has spread to, do you feel this? How do you feel this is potentially changing things?
I think the most important part of this is the people who have started using it. It's not necessarily by itself going to change minds, but I think what happens is, as we'll hear about, I think in a minute, this starts conversations, whether you're knitting it or making it into something like we saw the Tesla car or the magazine cover, or scarves. However you're doing it, you are initiating conversations. And so I spoke to the chap who painted his Tesla car with the stripes, and he took that car to a car meet, which he'd been doing for years and years. And he said he had more conversations about climate change in that one day than he had in his entire life, because he turned up with a car which was instantly, people wanted to know what it was all about. They didn't, as soon as you saw the graphic, you didn't necessarily know what it was about, but that prompted the conversations. People came and asked him, what is this all about? And so you instantly have engagement with someone who is in your community. And I think that's critical.
We'll go to Alex next in a minute, but I wanted to then let's go to the knitting, I think, at this point, because again, this is a really interesting additional community that this is spilled into. So could you introduce yourselves? It's Jim, and I don't have your names right in front of me. Just remind me.
I'm Emily, and this is Justin.
Hi. Justin, I'm so sorry. It's been that kind of a
day. So we started with actually this style of tempestry early on, and then once Ed released his visual, the stripes, then we added these as well. But we found sort of the same thing, that people really need to see it happening in their backyard, and so these are for 1 year of data in a specific location. And we've had people we did a collection here locally in our area. It goes back to 1950 and covers, I think we've got 25 pieces in that collection, and it ranges from 1950 to 2016. And we've had people, when we do these displays of them at various exhibits, people really sort of connect with seeing it like just in their backyard and in their hometowns, in a way that they don't when they look at global data or just hear news stories about what glacial melts and things that are happening far away from them. So I think it's a really powerful tool to bring it down onto a local scale for people.
So we had one woman at an exhibit walk down the line of these, going back to when she was a kid in the 1940s, and realized in our area that there was a lot more of the darker blue frozen winters back then, and just remembered that she used to go ice skating when she was a kid, and no one goes ice skating here anymore. There hasn't been frozen lakes in decades.
This is 2016. It just doesn't get that cold.
Yeah. So they sort of connect to seeing their particular years and their stories. And then what you were saying about the local stuff is really neat. So this obviously is one of the global pieces. but we've done them for different states and the United States as well. And we decided to put historical markers on it so people can see what happened in specific years. And, the years that their grandparents were born were darker blue, the years when their grandchildren are born are red. So that really resonates with people as well.
That's actually what's beaded into this piece here. These beads are Emma's grandparents' birth year, and then her parents, and then her and her brother up here, and then her brother's children up at the top. And it was going to be a Christmas present for them, but then it was too sad.
Depressing. So we kept it.
That's so cool. So you can add other dimensions, literally. I did see the way I found your work was a month or two ago on Twitter. I saw a more general, someone is knitting weather, like actual, remember the difference between weather and climate, but they were knitting the weather of a year with little distinct features being precipitation or temperature.
We've done precipitation beads, and we've had people of late even start adding gray mohair to the days for smoke out here because there's so many forest fires in recent years. So they've become real sort of historical records of the weather, and then in collections present the climate, which is pretty neat.
These are 1 year of high temperature data in every row is a day.
Wow. So how, I have friends who are rabid knitters, and there's been best-selling books. It's a big universe, right? There's people who are creating this kind of stuff.
Yeah. We've had at this point a couple thousand people knit these, mostly in the United States, but around the world as well. We've done kits now for every continent, which is pretty cool. Specific years. People doing their own collections in different towns and schools, and there's churches. Yeah, a lot of church groups are doing these, which is really interesting to us. So
that's fantastic. Well, we'll get back to this in a minute. I want to swing to Alex Radke in Germany and your work. Hold on 1 second while I pull something up on the screen. This is a low tech, I'm the producer. There's no magic hand here. So here, via a tweet of mine a while back, I started to notice Alex's work on Twitter, which was doing something very interesting. I'm a huge proponent of understanding what's called paleoclimatology, what history of climate tells us about the future and about current conditions too. As a journalist, it's harder to get audiences focused on the past, but it's really important. And that's why this work is great. But then it's like, okay, so here we are, what happens next? So unless I missed some earlier iterations of Ed's work, it kind of stops at now. And Alex, I saw using models, the emissions estimates, these emission scenarios that kind of bring it forward into the future. And it really was powerful to me to think of that. Now, what then I also learned is that Twitter was the interface that created this kind of visual conversation. Alex, can you describe how you first stumbled on Ed's work?
Thanks for having me here first. How I first stumbled on his work, I'm actually not sure, probably because, when you're quite into climate science, you kind of see this picture everywhere, and you already did in 2019, I think, when you were really interested. But the first time that I realized that it really had this power for people who are not into climate science, that was during the Fridays for Future protests in 2019, and there was one in, I think, March. Not sure about this right now, in Düsseldorf. And I was going there to get some motivation to finally see people going on the street for climate and not feeling like doing this stuff alone with, maybe your couple of peers. And now there's a real mass behind it. And those pictures, those stripes from Ed, were kind of everywhere. Not yet, not how that prominent like now, but they already were popping up all in the crowd everywhere. And that's where I thought, well, this is really powerful, and it's working for the masses and not just for a couple of online publications. And this was the idea to say, well, if this is so powerful, maybe we can get this emission trajectories, which are even more scary than the past, to be honest, in the same way, in the same format. And the side effect would be that, yeah, as you said, we're not on the right side of the graph anymore, but we are right in the center, and you can say, okay, now we are in charge here, now we're on the turning wheel, and we can decide whether it's going up or down, or at least how far it goes up.
By the way, here, I think this is March 2019. So here's Ed saying, wow, look, there's something interesting happening here.
I think this was the same day I published this on Twitter. Yeah.
Ed, can you describe, let's talk about Twitter as sort of a laboratory for this. Is this, what does this feel like? Is it exciting? Is it that dynamic? And Ulrika, I'm going to get you back in. You're going to get in here in a second too.
I mean, it's fantastic to essentially have everyone's brains working on the same problem, and inspiring ideas and feedback between different people having different ideas, and it's been brilliant to watch all of these innovative, novel, creative ideas come into being just by sort of collaborations between people, and it's just been inspiring to watch. And
are you, I understand this is the first time you've actually met up face to face.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
So feel free to ask each other a question or two before we go to the next part, if there's anything that comes to mind.
I remember, go on, Alex.
I was just wondering, first of all, how packed your day is by today, because I can imagine that you did this spirals work before, and you were one lead author of the IPCC, and now everyone who knows your name knows them because of this is the guy with the climate stripes, at least outside the climate science bubble, I guess. So how does this feel for you?
It's just amazing to see the front page of the Economist magazine using the graphic. I mean, that really brought it home for me that people are seeing this, very influential people seeing this all over the world, and seeing the badges worn in the US Senate during the State of the Union last year. I think that was also a very powerful demonstration that this was something which could prompt some conversations and discussions amongst very senior people. And so whether it's changed any minds, maybe Ulrika can tell us about whether these things actually change people's minds, or whether they just help spark conversations, which I think are going to be critical if people are going to accept the changes that are required, if we're going to end up on that lower trajectory that you see on the page. We have a choice where we are at the moment, which path we go. And if we want to end up on that lower trajectory, there's going to be some very, very difficult choices needs to be made about our lifestyles to end up on that trajectory. And we need everyone on board for that. And so having these conversations between friends and family and tribes that we live in, I think is critical.
Tribes for sure. Yeah. So Ulrika, can you just describe how you came to be in this body of work? How you focus on behavioral science? There needs to be much more of that on these issues. So maybe talk a little bit about what drew you to these kinds of questions. And I'm going to show your paper in a second.
Yes, sure. So I started maybe 5 years ago to really get into the topic of art in relation to sustainability and climate change. Back then, I wanted to first study a master program. I couldn't find it because it didn't exist yet. By now, of course, this has also changed. There's more of these combinations now also offered. But back then, it didn't exist yet, at least not here. So I first studied art and then sustainability in two separate programs. And then I wanted to combine those two topics. So I applied for a PhD grant together with my PhD supervisors. Among them is also Dr. Pauke Berkers, who wrote this particular paper with me back then. And then we got a grant to also study this in a PhD for 4 years. So I'm looking at the role of the visual arts in relation to climate change. So I'm not necessarily a behavioral scientist. I'm really coming in from the humanities, from the environmental humanities. And in my PhD, I look really at the role of artists and how they address climate change from more data-driven.
Sorry.
That's okay.
like
I love
what
it.
we maybe discussed today, to more to artworks that are not necessarily data driven. And the data focus a few years ago just, I think, came out of a personal interest, because I just also came across some of these data artworks, and I also made some myself. So it just had like a personal interest in that as well. And then it kind of also evolved into research back then.
Yeah, in fact, I hadn't really known that there was a journal called World Art that it's a peer-reviewed journal. I think this idea of the evolving interface between the humanities, social behavioral, and physical sciences is very powerful, an important step right now. Columbia is creating a climate school, a school of climate, and one of the implicit goals is to do more of that integrated assessment and experimentation. So it's really exciting.
Yeah.
Let me show your paper. I have it here because you have some other artwork in here too.
Yeah.
Can you just describe kind of the summary here? So you dug in on this question of visualizing climate change, and to me, of course, as a journalist, I always think about impact. I wouldn't. Is it worth doing what I do if it doesn't actually matter? So I like talking to scientists and people like you. What was your main thesis here?
Yeah, so we came in with this idea of what does it do to issue salience. So that means how important do they consider climate change? Right. There's also something called efficacy issue efficacy, which means that then you also feel you're more motivated to do something differently. But here it was really about issue salience. So how important do they consider climate change? And the specific question that we had, or the statement was, this image makes me feel climate change is important. Mm-hmm. So this was really like the kind of aspect that we were interested in knowing about more. And then we had different visualizations. Some of them, you can see here, like some of them were kind of the old school graph of, I think this is temperature increase. We had some photos as well, and a cartoon, some simulations of the future, and then the fifth one was this data-driven artwork, or different kinds of data artwork. So we kind of compared also different visualization types to see what works best, or where do people say this makes me really feel climate change is important. Yeah, you can see that here as well, this issue salience. And the audience, the decoding skills, how do they decode the images, and then the visual types on the left, the 5 different types.
And any initial, I know this is sort of a small initial study, but any clues?
Yeah, so this was indeed really, really small, so I cannot make any generalizations. This is the data art by Jill Pelto. She was really kind to also allow us to publish her artwork. So on the left, it's a painting of these people, but on the right, you see that she actually painted around lines, and I think this one was about glaciers and melting, and so she picked up this glacier topic here. And we also had another of her visualizations in the study. And yeah, it was quite an interesting finding for us to see that the data art, in comparison to the other visual types, was not creating the highest or one of the highest issue salience. It was the photographs that were really, really strong, because they were very immediate and really quickly understood. And for the data art, it was usually that the people didn't really understand what they were saying them. So they were a bit maybe also overwhelmed by what I'm looking at.
Oh, that's so interesting. So you got to get through those initial, you have to unpack a lot more, is what you're saying,
yeah.
I think.
Yeah, I think because we had some captions, but we didn't have, for example, a short explanation. Like what we see with the stripes, what I saw earlier, also on the website, is that it gives you a bit of context. I mean, it's very intuitive as well, the stripes by themselves, but it also, if you say this is like the temperature development from 1800 to 2000, it's very, very intuitive, very straightforward. But we also had some data art that was more complicated, I think, to interpret, and it would be really good to have like a kind of an explanatory text next to it. And the ones by Jill Pelto that we saw, they were actually found more clear because it was rather straightforward, the glaciers and then the lines. So they resonated quite well with people. And then we had also others where people were like, I mean, it looks nice, but I don't see the connection to climate change.
That's so interesting. Well, let's circle back to Ed and Alex. And what I'd like to think about sometimes with these shows I do, as we get toward the latter half, is what can we do together that we can't do alone? And Alex, I mean, Ed, I'm not sure how many behavioral scientists have worked with you yet on these next steps. I know you work with Yale's climate communication folks, but I'm talking about the assessment, the thing about longitudinally, does this stay with people when they're thinking about an energy choice, or is there a way to? So is there something to do here that comes to mind now that you're hearing some of this?
I'm sure there's lots of opportunities here. I mean, I haven't had those conversations yet with the behavioral scientists, and I would love to do that. I think there's lots of opportunity to learn about how people interpret and use these graphics and how it might change behaviors. We just haven't had the opportunity yet to do that, but I'd love to explore that a bit further. That
sounds really exciting, and I do think your website is a data portal too. You don't want people thinking their information is being used, but anonymously you can start to get a sense of who's using that and what are they doing with that.
I mean, we certainly have visitors downloading graphics, from virtually every country. I mean, we don't track it in detail, but we, the first week we launched it 2 or 3 years ago, we had 1 million downloads in the first week. So, it's a large number of people using it, downloading it. And for virtually every country, there was at least one visitor. So that's very encouraging.
Interesting. I wonder, I'm just going to offer some quick reactions here. Because these patterns are so distinctive, and when one's generated for Zambia, I would think that there are visual crawlers. Google would have a way to keep track of where these pop up. It's just like when you think of Google image search, you could have an algorithm that sort of follows how they're being used, where they pop up. That seems like an interesting possibility. I don't know if that makes sense, Ulrika.
Sorry, can you repeat?
Because visual trackers on the web, like Google image search, are so effective. It sounds like you could, if someone wanted to do research where you're seeing, as Ed said, 1 million downloads of work generated on this website, which you put in your town, you put in your state in the United States, and you get your state's symbol, and then that generates an image which can be tracked using image search. It feels like there's probably some interesting work that could be done to see how this all plays out on Twitter or other platforms.
I think that sounds great, actually, to look at to analyze social media, which we haven't done, of course, but I think that would be an interesting avenue to analyze the engagement based on such engagement on Twitter, via social media, or via the website and the downloads.
And I do think behaviorally, of course, Ed, what's really cool about having the website and warning stripes, potentially depending on where that goes, is that it's not just experiencing an image as an audience. They're actually generating the image. I think that's probably thinking about engagement or understanding. If you're generating the image, you own it. That probably has more of a impact. But I'm only guessing. I'm not a sociologist or a psychologist.
So people sharing it, actively adding it to their Facebook profile or their Twitter profile, that just an act of sharing something, is also crucial. And I think, as we heard from the knitting aspect, actually physically sitting and making something also makes it more tangible and more real. And if you're wearing a scarf and you're out, you can show someone tangibly and make them touch it, which again makes it more physical and more real. And so I think those aspects are they're hard to capture online. And I think probably a lot of the best conversations and impact from this type of activity will happen offline. and not be able to be captured by some automatic way of crawling or something like that. So that's definitely going to be of interest, but I think we can't. A lot of the conversations we can't capture.
Yeah, I want to get back to the knitting briefly here because looking at these more closely, this is the not specifically the Tempestry project. This is someone I think in the UK.
It is. She does
who's
good work
knitting.
as well.
She's knitting the weather,
Mhm.
and here's the base. There's her socks. I like that. But here, look. This is the part again. Getting back to what you said about beads. Here are these specific threads with specific codes. This is data. You got snowy, cloudy, rainy, sunny. Something about this totally excites me. Not that I knit.
We wanted to take a quick moment to show you, especially Ed, over the last year, we've had a lot of yarn supply issues because of the pandemic. And so we ended up developing our own line of yarn to make Tempestries. And so this is our color card.
Let me
all the warming stripes colors.
Let me make you bigger.
Oh,
hold it up again.
Let's see if we can do this better.
That's good. Yeah.
So these are, the colder blues at the bottom, and then up into the oranges and the reds. So it's been sort of a process developing this own, US-based yarn and figuring out how to get around the yarn supply chain issues that we've had during the pandemic. But so we have people using this yarn, and like you were saying, it's just such a tactile way of processing the data. So that's been a big thing for us this year.
And as far as engagement goes, it does, one thing I think we found is knitting a piece like this, whether it's 1 year of data or the warming stripes, just somebody taking the time to handcraft it, imbues it with a level of importance that it's harder for people to dismiss when they see it scrolling by or something. It's tactile, it's tangible, and people are more inclined to give it a minute and contemplate it. And we've taken these, I put them up on a big pole, like a war banner from medieval times, and take them to the March for Science protests and stuff.
Oh, interesting.
And it's really fun to see people, their eyes are immediately drawn to it, and then you watch them sort of pan it with their eyes, and then you can see the instant it clicks, what they're looking at.
And then they come over and want to touch it and talk about it.
See it and talk about it and stuff. But it's very they don't need a little placard. Oftentimes I'll have the top and bottom labeled with the years, or the little plaque with the year if it's one of the original pieces. But that's pretty much all they need to understand what it is that they're looking at. And then they're interested and come over and want more details about it.
Yeah.
This is such ripe terrain, and what I hope to convey sometimes to people is that thinking back through the steps we've just described, Twitter just launched in 2007. The internet itself is not that old. Thinking back to the history of the printing press, a completely disruptive process for better and worse. Here we're in the earliest stages of this kind of testing and the integration of behavioral humanities and other sciences is also novel. It's not the norm. Funders don't yet really fund it. They are starting to. So someone could be studying how this is spreading through the knitting community too. There are some studies I haven't mentioned yet. Maybe toward the end I'll show one where there's been some sense of efficacy. There's the University of Plymouth, some researchers have done studies of people's decisions around their home energy efficiency at home, how to insulate their homes, where when they show them images of taken with an infrared camera that shows the glow of your house, meaning as a proxy for wasted heat, they're more apt to follow up even a year later. They're more apt to have done something than people who just got the information. But again, I could count these studies, I think, on this many fingers. It feels
I can totally relate to this. So when I did this in university with people, and we're going from house to house and did some neighborhood walk around the houses, and they could see their own houses through the infrared camera. And I still have contact with some people of them from, I don't know, 9 years ago, because we were showing them their house and how their waste heat is there and what they can do. And last half a year ago, one of them actually mailed me again and said, "Oh no, we finally did this and changed our windows because you were showing us this picture 8 years ago." so yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, but this is again this topic of getting the stuff offline and on the street, and you walk with them, and that's, I think, also the strength of this graphics, because it's so easy to print, so easy to present offline. So.
Well, and I'm just going to show something related to what you were describing. This is in Canada. There's an organization that is mapping neighborhood heat. Let's see if I can make this bigger. And you can see how it would be good for this not to be sort of a finger pointing, "Ooh, you're wasting heat" kind of dynamic, and more of a, "Wow, look what my house did. I had a house that used to be orange and now it's green." Meaning you're displaying with excitement, that transition that Alex was describing. It feels like there's a lot of potential there on social media too. You think people are always eager to, that's how Facebook evolved, right? I think this girl is not so hot. You can argue with the origins of Facebook, but it is a place where people are thinking about this kind of thing, comparisons. So maybe Ulrika, one more time from you. I have a feeling you were taking notes. Does all this? Who else could we get into the conversation here to make this a bigger one?
So I had to think about an artist while I was listening to the knitting project. Maybe you also have contact with her or know her. Natalie Miebach. I think she's based in the US, and she's doing these kind of also with knitting, but also like sculptures, and also sculptures made from knitting, based on climate data, based on the development of storms or how they become more extreme, and or maybe also the geography of them. I'm not entirely sure about the topics, but it immediately reminded me of her artistic work. So I think that's, I saw kind of a relation to that artist while I was listening to the knitting project.
I'm not familiar with her. What is her name? Natalie
Miebach, or Miebach. So Miebach.
I'll look her up.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, that was something. You're having her on your.
Yeah, she did a TED. She was a TED fellow, I think, and someone has here making music and art from weather data. If I could show it.
Yeah, she's also using sound, so it's like this audio-visual engagement.
We currently have an exhibit at the Berman Museum of Ursinus College, and I created a piece using the Global Stripes data of a sound piece and just set it to C major scale so people can hear it play out over like 2.5 minutes or something.
To make it more accessible for people who can't see it as well, or
I'll show. Sorry, keep going.
No, I just wanted to say that's also interesting, like this additional component of audio, making it immersive in a sense as well. So or experiential almost. That's definitely also interesting for engagement, I think.
Yeah, and helps with accessibility issues as well, which we definitely want to do and bring people in. So.
Oh, in terms of different impairments and the like too, right?
Right.
Not everyone can see stripes.
Or color, or
Yeah, color blindness, exactly. Yeah. So what a frontier you're all on here. Do any of you have another question for anyone else? While you do that, I'm going to pull up an example of some of the music. I imagine there's a question there.
I mean, I've seen so many people, create physical versions of this as well. Like, people have painted their fingernails or colored their hair, made them out of glass. There's someone making a giant glass sculpture that's meters long with the stripes, and someone's done a pottery vase as well with all the stripes. It's just brilliant to see all these physical, artistic manifestations of these graphics.
Well, here's one. Hold on, I want to get it right. At Dream. Whoops. This doesn't have stripes, but this was Julio Friedman, who's a physicist working on carbon capture, and you can see this is basically this was the 1,000-year data set.
Yeah.
And again, how do you measure impact and longevity of impact? Those are really important questions going forward. Ed, let me see. I'm going to show some of your tweets from this morning. What's happening elsewhere today? I know in an hour or so, you're going to be on with Climate Central, which has been a big promoter of this.
That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the big thing today that is novel about today is that we have weather forecasters involved. So we try and do this every year, where we get the TV meteorologists around the world to show the stripes for their own country. And I think the real plus about having TV meteorologists involved is that they're trusted messengers and they're trusted voices for presenting the weather every day. And I think them talking about climate and climate change is a really good step forward. And so this has been led by Jeff Berardelli in the US. He inspired this sort of movement, and he's been doing a lot of work to encourage his fellow meteorologists to get involved. And so I've seen TV presenters in Australia, in Japan, in Uganda, Argentina, Spain, the UK, the US, all on their live broadcasts today, show the stripes and talk about climate change in their own countries and their own regions. And so I think that's been really, really beneficial to explain it to a very broad audience.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to show a tweet of Jeff's because it's right on your point. Let's see if I can get this here. Yes, this is today.
Yeah.
Stripes in different parts of the world. And I mean, this to me, of course, conveys something important, which is the globe is warming, but your local climate is changing. The average temperature of the planet. No one, Ed, maybe you know which communities around the world live in the average climate, like at 60 degrees Fahrenheit. I think San Diego is one. There are places where there's almost no heating days and cooling days.
Okay.
But very few people in the world live in the average climate, right? So
this
is help with that too.
And everyone's vulnerable to different things. You know, every country has different risks from a changing climate. You know, in some regions it'll be heat waves, in others it'll be floods, in others it'll be sea level rise. And every region is changing in a slightly different way. And communicating that locally is really, really important. You know, you see in the tropics, although the tropics is not warming quite as fast as the higher latitudes, actually, when you look at some of the tropical countries, it's actually, the warming is actually clearer. You see less variation from year to year because the tropics just has less variation in its weather and in its climate from year to year. And so the changes in the tropics are actually, although they may be slightly smaller in magnitude, they're larger in terms of pushing the system away from the climate it's used to. And so potentially some of the tropics are seeing the largest impacts because they're being pushed away from the climate they're used to experiencing far faster than other places, which have a more variable climate. So you actually see that, which is also really novel, I think.
And are there precipitation stripes yet?
I've done a handful. I haven't done them coherently and consistently, but I have made a couple myself, yes.
It is a challenge there because, you know, water is the main interface between people and climate that matters, except for storm impacts. And there it gets complicated in a hurry, right? The monsoon, some of these really important parts of the world have so much inherent variability in things like precipitation that it would be, the picture might be fuzzier than the picture we're looking at for temperature.
It certainly is. I mean, the changes in rainfall are far noisier than for temperature. There are a lot more different seasonally as well. You know, you often get counteracting signals In the UK, we're probably getting wetter winters, but maybe ever so slightly drier summers. And so there's all these competing factors. And also, if we're looking at the historical record for rainfall, also particularly, you see the signal of sulfate aerosols quite clearly in some regions. And so the past trends aren't necessarily a guide to the future as we take the aerosols out of the atmosphere. And so there's those complications as well.
But that's what leads back to the value of this, is it just as an engagement pathway.
Yes.
And actually, I think this topic about aerosols is the one I've mostly spoken about when showing those stripes, because there were points in this when I look at Ed's shoulders at this small whiter part right beside the blue part, says, oh, why it's getting colder after this? And then you start talking about, the aerosols aren't there and otherwise would be heating. And this is a kind of make the favor for us to make it even more interesting, and then making a small bump. And people are always asking about this as for me as well as the first thing. Well, there's something odd about it.
Yeah. Well, I think we're close to the end here. We don't have to go the full hour. Ed, I know you have an incredibly busy day ahead of you. And maybe I'll ask you one more time. What's your advice to scientists who crave being more communicative, but fear it at the same time?
It's certainly, as soon as you become a vaguely public figure, you do start getting negative reactions from some. And I've certainly had that today, and as I do every other day of the week, and that's normal. And unfortunately, it's part of reality, and you just have to ignore it. But that will certainly happen. But there's so much support out there. We're a real community online. We support each other. We give each other ideas, different ways of communicating. We share ways that work and ways that don't work of communicating. And so I'll certainly encourage any scientist who wants to get involved with communicating visually or in print or however you fancy doing it, because it's incredibly rewarding when you get positive responses.
And maybe, Alex, one thing that the work that you're both doing illustrates to me is that connectivity, amid all the noise, there's lots of negatives, but platform like Twitter can be a real laboratory for progress, I think. And you're demonstrating that in the kind of the crosstalk you're doing. Does that feel, Alex, does that keep you going? I know Twitter, again, is can be a very dark place sometimes.
Yeah, it can, but definitely but I have the feeling that a lot of those climate visualizations we now have, and we actually needed to get this support, wouldn't be there without Twitter, because it was kind of a community where you can self-publish. You can just throw it out and see people engaging or not engaging, and then you can, okay, this works good, this works not so good, and I can put a lot more work inside of this or inside of that. And it's a place where you can get easily some inspiration because people are trying things out, and you can see, this is a way that might work.
And I guess for Justin, for the Tempestry project, one of the great values of what you're doing is taking it out of the digital space. You share and you gain community that way, but that physical property that you're dealing with seems invaluable too. I don't know if you could hold up what you're working on if you still have it nearby.
Oh, yes. And I wanted to say too that what I'm starting is based on Ed's data going back to the year 0. So this will be about 40 feet long by the time I'm done with it, with I think the reds just in the last century or so. I'm not quite sure what we'll do with it, but we're hoping to have it displayed somewhere, probably not for another year or two. We'll see how long it takes to make.
We actually had a version of this that was a couple hundred years along, and then we switched to our new yarn. So
starting over again. But thank you for putting all of that together. It's going to be an amazing thing to get to create. So
it was great because I was working on trying to put together a data set using tree ring data, reconstructions and stuff, and then you released that set, and I was like, oh, this is so much easier.
Yeah, so, I mean, the Pages team have done all the hard work by giving us the data, and that'll be amazing when you see that.
It should be interesting.
I mean, the last 2,000 years are so compelling when you see that rapid warming over the last 100 years that just stands out so much. It's a very, very
really
message.
Shows that it's human based in a way that the other ones don't quite as much.
Yeah.
So. Yeah.
And oh, by the way, you mentioned the sources of data. That's such a critical part of this too, not just individual scientists. Are you still craving more data repositories to be getting into this, Ed?
Yeah,
Who's not yet engaged? Who could be?
So we tend to use the Berkeley Earth temperature data set for most countries. Some countries have their own national data sets, which we've used in preference because we want to use their own national countries' data, but it is available for every country. There is other aspects here that there is more data out there, of course, in the past, still stuck in the archives. Every single country has more temperature data, more rainfall data, more pressure data in their archives, still on paper, that we want to rescue and turn into digital data that will improve our estimates of the past. And that's another key issue. And data sharing, most countries are very good at sharing their data in real time, but some countries are not still, or even past data. And so that does prove problematic sometimes. And the more open we can all be, the better, I think.
Yeah, I've ran into paywalls on data, like through various organizations and governments. Even it's very frustrating.
Yeah,
that is a big issue for sure. Open data, open access to peer-reviewed literature. The other thing I've written about is these pretty significant gaps in not just data, but meteorological and climate capacity in developing countries. The places that are most vulnerable often have hardly anything to work with in terms of understanding their own variability and change.
And so, unfortunately, some of those countries are ones which don't necessarily share all their data because they don't have the capacity to release it in a way that will be usable by other communities. And so those countries could benefit an awful lot by being able to have the capacity to share their data, because then they get a lot more feedback and a lot more analysis of their own country and be able to make decisions. But unfortunately, that developing world needs a lot of help there, I think.
And finally, Ulrika, what is the next steps for your community in the arts and at the interface of arts, social sciences, and data? What would be, like, who could we bring into a conversation if we do this again in a month or two, who could help make this, give some more momentum?
At the intersection of art and data, I think it would also be really interesting to maybe look at some public interventions. So I know there are some artists that are also very participatory, in a very participatory way, engage other people. Also what you talked about earlier, like that you really get engaged yourself and you do something, you make something. So there are some artists out there who make public art interventions and include the community as well. For example, I know of one project where they draw the water line of projected sea level rise in certain cities, also together with researchers and artists and people from the community. So I find that quite interesting as well. So kind of the art intervention approach. And yeah, I mean, for data and art, I think there's also a lot developing in the last years. It's really great to see. I think it's really, great to see the changes from, if I would just compare it to 5 years ago. So it's just incredible to see this development. Yeah.
That's great. Well, and also encouraging people to follow you. You can see there the image of your Twitter account. This all gets archived right away, so anyone can go back and look for specific references we've made. And I think that we're at the point where we're done for now. But these Earth Institute Sustain What conversations are always, they're kind of like the knitting. They are a process more than a product. So I hope we can meet up. Well, they're both, right? Knitting definitely you end at some point.
At some point.
But the process is really important. So I'm hoping we can keep at this and dig in a little deeper on some of these questions we discussed today. I'll show you just as an example, that last a paper from another area that's relevant, and maybe it'll spark some new work for new ideas for some of you and anyone watching. Hold on one more second. And, yeah, this is the work that Plymouth University has been part of. Alex, this gets at what you were saying. And one of the things that resonates with what you were just describing earlier is that they did 3 or 4 different iterations of this project where they, rather than scrolling through, I'll just stay here. They showed some people just the information. If you do this to your windows, you'll save money and energy. Some got a generic picture of a house like this one, and some got a picture of their own house. And then a year later, they were doing surveys to see who did stuff. And it was the ones who had that personal engagement that had the most stickiness. So that feels like, again, an important model to think about going forward. Longitudinal work to see what sticks, what doesn't. Thank you very much for being here today. Tempestry project, which is moving from the West Coast to my part of the Hudson Valley. Very exciting. And Ed Hawkins, who kind of got this all going, and Alexander Radke, who's keeping it going and making it forward-looking, and Ulrika Hahn, who's bridging that gap between the arts and the sciences in very exciting ways. Thanks for being here today. Anyone out there, you can find out ways to get in touch with me for future ideas for the show or feedback. Look at the little distracting scrolling bar down there, and you can see that too. This gets archived right away, 4 different places: YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. So do share it with others as soon as we're done. All day today is Show Your Stripes Day. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.